So I have a couple questions to start you with, and this one's going to be for all three of you. So what was your most memorable moment from meeting one of the POWs? Your most memorable moment from meeting one of the POWs. And Scott, let's start with you.
It's because I knew this question was coming. So I was probably met, you guys met more POWs than I did, but I was able to speak with Mr. William Funchess, and he was probably 88 or 89 at the time in his house in South Carolina, and he was a farm boy, grew up on a farm like Father, and they spent the last about 3 weeks together. William would take care of Father because he was so sick. Slept next to each other and everything at night. And but he said the first time he met him is, I think, the most impactful story for me. William had been at a different battle, captured later, and actually didn't meet Father until they were back at Pyeok Kong in January. And he said he noticed this guy kind of messing around on the ground and realized he was making a fire. And he said, I quickly determined I didn't want to go over there because of the trouble that could get me in being associated with him. But he said that this guy waved me over, and he was dressed kind of ragged and everything, and he offers me a drink. And he said, why yes, I would like a drink of water. And he says he takes a drink and he hands it back to him, the cup. He says, thank you. That was the first drink of water that I've had for 2 months. And I was again sitting there with him, and I looked at him, and he said, after we were captured, the North Koreans didn't give us any water to drink, and so we just had to eat snow to stay alive. And he looked at me and he said, that was the best drink of water that I've had in my entire life. And it stuck with me so much. I think, again, part of it was hearing it in person. I mean, when you meet these fellows, it's just incredible. But just those little things, that one little act of kindness, I think, was what really stuck with me.
Thank you, Scott. Father John?
I'm going to have to talk about two different POWs. The first one, and this would have happened shortly after I started looking into the cause, was a Dr. Essenson. He was the doctor that would have cared for Father Kapaun there in the POW camp towards the end of Father Kapaun's life. He lived in Minneapolis. He wasn't supposed to go over to Korea. He had been in World War II and gotten out of the army after World War II, and then he was called back up to go into the army. They told him that he would probably just be in Tokyo because he was a pediatrician. They said that he would probably be in Tokyo at one of the hospitals there, and that they would probably just be he'd be taking care of kids that they would send over from Korea that had been harmed in the war or whatever. So I was going to talk to him up in Minnesota, Minneapolis. When I walked into his apartment and sat down, the first thing he said to me was, "Father, I haven't slept with my wife for 50 years. And my first thought was, TMI. And then he started explaining, and he said, every time I try to sleep with my wife, she wakes up with bruises. And he said that he still has nightmares from the war, and that at night he thrashes around in bed, and he said, if I sleep with her, or if we sleep in the same bed, then she will be hurt. And so that really kind of struck me, and I mean, it kind of set the tone for my interview with him at first, but when he talked to me and he talked to me about this, I was really kind of taken aback. The other one would have been Herbert Miller. You know the story of Father Kapaun carrying him the miles to the POW camp. But when you talk to Herbert Miller, he is convinced that, and I agree with him, he is convinced that God sent Father Kapaun to him. And he said he was there in that ditch. He said he couldn't stand up on his left leg. It had been broken by a grenade that had gone off at his feet. He had spent the hours before that with a dead Korean soldier on top of him because he was trying to hide from the Chinese and North Korean soldiers because he knew if they found him, they would kill him. The soldiers had been told if you were injured, they were not interested in taking you as a prisoner because if you couldn't walk, they didn't want to have anything to do with you, so they would just put you to death. And so he said when Father Kapaun came and took him or helped him up, he said that was God telling Father Kapaun to do it. And he said, I don't know why God sent Father Kapaun to me to help me out. And he said, for all of these years, he said, the one thing that I still question and the one thing that I want to know is why me? He said, why did God send Father Kapaun to me? And he said, I've been living all these lives, my life after the war, and he said, it's a question I ask myself every day. He said, it's a question in which I'm grateful that Father Kapaun was in my life, that Father Kapaun saved my life. But he said, I still have to ask, why me? He said, that's what I hope to ask God when I meet him face to face, is why me? And I think the same thing can be said by so many people whose lives have been touched by Father Kapaun, even to this day and age. Why me? I ask it myself. I mean, why did Bishop Olmsted ask me to go about and start to learn about Father Kapaun's life? Certainly I'm a better priest because of it. I hope I'm a better priest because of it. But certainly I think my life and the lives of so many other people have been touched because of Father Kapaun. So why us? Why you?
Thanks, Father. Bill?
Right guy in the right place, wrong guy in the right place at the right time.
There we go.
I mentioned earlier that after Father Kapaun's death, after ceasefire negotiations began, the Chinese recognized that the POWs were bargaining chips. And as part of that negotiation, they began torturing pilots who were shot down and forcing them to sign confessions or make broadcasts confessing to the use of drone warfare. And I interviewed one of these men. I can't recall his name now. I think I tell the story in the book. And at the point where he knew that he wasn't going to survive the next round of torture because the Chinese guards took him out in a cornfield in bare feet in the dead of winter, cracked open a puddle in the ice. They broke the ice with the butts of their rifles and ordered him to lie down on his chest in the pool of icy water. And he endured that once, and he knew he would not survive a second round of that. So he wrote a lengthy and very detailed confession regarding his role in dropping the secret FQU bomb on the North Koreans. And he figured that if he ever made it back, that the Air Force would realize that that there was no such weapon. So I remember that, but I'm gonna cheat and tell a second story as well. And this was about another Air Force pilot who had been an accomplished fighter pilot, Marvin Tajman. And he was a retired colonel and a widower living by himself in an Air Force retirement community in Riverside, California. And Marvin had Alzheimer's, which makes for a tough interview because we videoed him, and he could barely remember anything. Couldn't remember dates, couldn't remember names, couldn't remember places. And this was my first experience with an Alzheimer's victim and it was tough for me. But then after talking with him for about 30 or 35 minutes on tape, and it was a pretty disjointed conversation. His daughter, who was there, said, "Dad, why don't you show him your trophy room?" And he took me into another room in his house, and there were all his mementos from his 30 years in the Air Force, to include quite a few mementos like his brass spoon from his time as a POW. The Chinese had put him in the hole for several weeks, and he didn't break, and they eventually gave up. Maybe they got a better target, but they eventually gave up, and he and his fellow Air Force pilots who had been tortured concocted some little song with some fairly obscene lyrics about the Chinese, set to some popular American song at the time, and he recited that for me before I left, and he could remember that song, and when he was showing me the artifacts from his captivity and his career in the Air Force, his eyes just lit up, and all of a sudden he didn't have Alzheimer's anymore. All of a sudden he was in his element, and there was nothing wrong with his memory of that. And when we left, his daughter was in tears. We were in tears. So, not my best interview, but certainly one of the most moving I've ever had. And it was an honor to spend an hour or two with that guy while I still could. So, good question.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, Scott, question for you. You get to speak with people all over the world about the cause, about Father Kapaun's life. How have you seen his work, his influence on other people, and maybe especially anything about a year ago when the homecoming happened?
Yeah, I think it's, well, as I mentioned, I mean, it is one of the privileges. It's interesting to see people coming to pray, people going to his hometown, coming to the cathedral to pray and everything. And I think we just had one about a month ago who was a helicopter pilot who had, for the Army, suffered severe colon cancer because of the burn pits from Iraq, and I think served 5 tours. Came to know about Father Kapaun after the war, but really when he was diagnosed, started to pray to him, and he said, when I was in the Army, I was willing to give my life to save my men, and this is just an extension of that. It's not when I'm overseas, in a war zone, but it's an extension of that. But I prayed, Father, you understood what it was like to be a soldier. You understood, just the challenges that we're going through, and being willing, if it's possible, to really offer help. And they went to the Mayo Clinic and had a lot of good doctors, I think, but the doctors really weren't going to operate, but because of his age, he was about 39 or 40, they decided to, and the operation was a great success, much better than they thought. The recovery was pretty incredible, really no complications whatsoever. And they came down and had one more round of chemo. I think that he was going through radiation, and came and prayed, and just to kind of offer thanks, and just as a final thank you, I talked with him and everything. But I went in later that afternoon, and he had left his patch there, and they didn't mention it, but I just was so moving. I left it there, and I put it in my office for now because just need place to keep it, but it's powerful to see that. I also think there's a really interesting story. I mean, I don't know. It's wonderful to talk to people, and sometimes we ask, people. It's just incredible to see, like the extent that he's reached and the impact, and it's in so many different ways, from kids who are 7 years old to veterans to anywhere in between. How powerful I think his story is, and I think it's a good reminder that we can love God, we can love our country, we can work for both to better both. And we do get some of those interesting stories. One of the most interesting ones that I've heard actually came from an elder in the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, so the Mormon Church. And he sent me an email a couple years ago and said, I served in Iraq and was really struggling to fulfill his duties as a chaplain. I think a lot of anxiety and fear. And he said, I started praying to God. And one night this guy appeared to me, and he was dressed in all white, an all-white suit, trousers, shoes, belt, everything white. He said, trust in God, trust in your Army training, and you'll be fine. He said, I woke up the next morning, and I just had this sense of peace about me that stayed with me the rest of the time, which is a very characteristic thing that I've heard of Father, both on the battlefield and now. And he said, it wasn't until about 10 or 12 years later, I was doing some research on the Battle of Unsan, I saw Father's picture, and I realized who it was that appeared to me. So, yeah, pretty incredible. So, most of the time, yeah, I've never seen him like that, but you never know. There's interesting stories out there. So, yeah.
That's a great story, Scott. Thank you. Hey, Bill. I understand that your testimony really helped with the Medal of Honor award for Father Kapaun. Can you tell us a little bit about that award? Why it's such a big deal, and why it took 60 years for it to be awarded?
Thanks, Mike. So it is a big deal. It's the highest award a member of the military can receive for valor, and it was not developed. There was no Medal of Honor prior to the Civil War. Really, our first medal for valor was the Purple Heart, and that was developed during the Revolutionary War. And we didn't have a lot of other medals for valor that we awarded to service members prior to the Civil War, but it was such a big war, and there were so many acts of courage that Congress decided to pass this legislation and create this medal. So it's a big deal, and over the past 160 years, the process for nominating someone and selecting someone for the Medal of Honor, we don't say one, we say awarded to, because a lot of the recipients receive it posthumously, so it's not exactly something people are competing to win. But the medal now is, so anybody in the service can nominate anyone else for a medal. And then that nomination goes up through the chain of command. Your first line supervisor reviews it, and if he endorses it, then it goes to the next line and the next line and the next line. And so that's time consuming. And at any point along the way, if someone says no, that's where it ends. Which, by the way, was why I did not nominate Father Kapaun for the Medal of Honor, although I could have. I'm a competent writer, and I knew the story, and I certainly felt he was fully deserving, and a colleague of mine said, if you do that, it'll take forever, and odds of success are slim or none. But if you provide the information you've gathered in your research to the family, they could conceivably provide it to their local congressman, who could then provide it to the Secretary of the Army. And if a congressman asks the Secretary of the Army to consider someone for this medal, that A, bypasses all of those intermediate approvals, and B, the service secretaries, the Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy, etc., are obliged by their position to respond in a responsive time frame to these types of requests from U.S. representatives. And that is, in fact, essentially what happened. I provided the results of my research to the Kapaun family here in Wichita. They, in turn, provided it to Congressman Tiart's office, and he, in turn, submitted it to the Secretary of the Army. And several previous attempts had failed to gain approval, but as luck would have it, that attempt worked, and so I'm grateful to have played a small part in that. But what took so long? Two things. The first factor was that the Army, unlike the Air Force and the Navy, the Army was very reluctant to consider prisoners of war for the Medal of Honor. And I think that reluctance stemmed largely from the fact that a number of, several hundred members of the Army POWs were accused of collaborating with the enemy after they were repatriated in Korea. And in some cases, those accusations were accurate and valid, and those men deserved to be punished, and they were. And in other cases, those accusations were wrongful accusations, and in other cases, quite frankly, it was pretty complicated issue. But in any case, because the majority of POWs in Korea had been Army personnel, and because the majority of POWs accused of collaboration had been Army personnel, the Army was particularly sensitive about the perception that we were awarding medals to people who had this taint on them. Unfairly, I believe, we've over the last 70 years since the war ended, unfairly characterized the bulk of POWs who served in Korea because of the bad behavior of a few, and hopefully my book and others like it have served to address some of those misperceptions. But anyway, so there was a built-in Army, almost an unwritten rule against considering former POWs for the Medal of Honor. That changed, fortunately, in the late 90s and early 2000s, about the time Congressman T. Hart was making his efforts. The other thing that we limited, that took more time, was the fact that by law, the services any nominations for a medal for valor are supposed to be submitted within a certain time frame. And of course, the time frame for Father Kapaun had long since expired. So those two factors were the main reason that it took so long.
Thank you, Bill. We have a question right over here.
Sir, the medal chaplains make the smallest four of all the branches of the military. How many chaplains have been awarded the Medal of Honor, and what's their religious affiliation?
Well, I don't know how many. I know at least 5 have received the Medal of Honor. Okay. So 8. I'm going to give myself partial credit. There's the famous 4 chaplains who sacrificed their lives for others when a cargo ship was sunk, a troop ship was sunk in the North Atlantic during World War II. They gave up their seats on lifeboats for other men. And that's an incredible story. I encourage you to find out more about those 4 chaplains, and I believe they're known now as the 4 chaplains. I'm sorry?
The Dorchester?
I think that sounds right. And then Chaplain Kapaun, obviously, I'm not familiar with the other 3 chaplains. But I will tell you that the Chaplains Corps at Fort Jackson is well aware of Emil Kapaun, and they celebrate his life and his service, and he's a big deal. And every chaplain who wears Army brass understands who Chaplain Kapaun is.
I'm going to ask Father Hotze one more question, and then I'll get to your question. We'll open it up to everybody. So I want to continue on this Medal of Honor discussion and ask Father, you were present for the Medal of Honor ceremony. Can you kind of just give us a sense of what that was like, your impressions, kind of your emotions during that ceremony?
It was one of the most moving days of my life. While there's a lot of things that you can see in the government. You can sit back and you can point at different things that are wrong. Easy to do. On that day, it was a day that everything was right. Seeing the Medal of Honor ceremony, the whole way it took place. I mean, it was just kind of awe-inspiring. The thing that I think was probably touched me more than anything else was there were 9 POWs that were there, that were in the prison camp number 5 with Father Kapaun. They were taken care of. This was during the Obama administration, and when we heard of the medal being awarded, a quick story that I find very, very humorous. Helen Kapaun, Father Kapaun's sister-in-law, was the first one that was notified of the Medal of Honor. And she was to receive a call from President Obama, who was going to tell her that he had been awarded the Medal of Honor. So she was at home, a daughter was there, and she answered the phone, and the person answering the phone said that, "Will you take a call from President Obama?" And she thought it was a joke or something. So she said no, and she hung up. So then they called back, and Helen didn't really believe what was going on, and she said, "Well, why don't you call back when my daughter's here?" So they called back a little while later when her daughter had come back home, and they explained to her that President Obama would like to speak to her, and would she arrange it? So they arranged it for the next day, and so that's when she took the call from President Obama that he had been awarded the Medal of Honor. So in that phone call, they asked her to promise not to let anybody know about this until the Army broke the story, or until the White House broke the story. So she did, and I think David is here today, and I think you'll attest to it. If I understand the story right, she did tell nobody. I mean, even her daughter was there when she took the phone call. She wouldn't tell her what was going on, and it wound up being months later when she finally was able to break the news. But it's my understanding that she still didn't tell any of you guys until they gave her permission to tell.
Almost the last minute.
That's right, exactly. And then when we were able to tell, or able to break the news, I remember they came and talked to, it was Bishop Jacobs at that time. They came to talk to Bishop Jacobs and myself down at the Chancery office. And then they told us that we couldn't divulge that information to anybody until they were ready to break the story. So for the next 2 weeks, Bishop Jacobs would come down to my office and just stick his head in my door and says, "Can I tell it yet? Can I tell it yet?" No, Bishop. So it was the most impressive event that I think I've ever seen. We could see our country, I think, at its best. The POWs received the honor that they so rightly deserved. After the immediate ceremony, and Obama was through talking, he and Michelle left and went to a room that was right outside the room where they did the presentation. And each one of the POWs got out and was able to meet him, and he shook their hands and they greeted him. And it was kind of funny. Of those 9 POWs, when I called them up to tell them about the award and asked if they would come to the ceremony, there was only one that was readily said that he would go, and all the other ones said, "Well, yeah, but I don't know if I want to go to President Obama and, about that stuff." And so I told them all, I said, "It's fine if you don't want to go or whatever," but I said, "Remember, this is Father Kapaun. This isn't Obama that we're talking about. It's Father Kapaun." And that day, after that day, every one of them was so glad that they had been able to come, because they could finally see Father Kapaun receive the honor that they so felt that he deserved. So.
That's great. Okay. We're going to open it up for questions now, and I'm going to start right over here.
I'm sort of shifting gears here. This might be more for you, Father, this question, but it came up a couple of weeks ago that one of the dicasteries at the Vatican made a public statement regarding the canonization process of Father Kapaun, that they were putting a kibosh on it because he was in the military. So how is that impacting or will impact Father Kapaun's cause?
Everybody hear the question? Okay, I'm going to pick the mic around from now on, but basically it was some reports out of the Vatican a couple weeks ago about Father Kapaun's process, and that there's some question about how it will continue. So she wants to know how that might affect the cause for Father Kapaun.
I don't think it will affect the cause for Father Kapaun at all. While his being a military chaplain was one of the reasons why they asked to put a halt to his cause, there were several other reasons that they put forth. And I think his being the military chaplain was the last of those reasons. I think the ones that they were considering, and that they were considering more important than him being in the military, I think were more of the reason why they asked for his cause to be halted. And currently the military archdiocese, who is promoting that cause, they're working on giving a statement to respond to the dicastery of the saints for that. So there's still some work to be done on it. I don't know how it will fall out. I think it was sad that they brought those reasons forth, but I really don't think the military was the primary or the main focus in it. I think some of the other questions they had for the military archdiocese were probably more important than what they said about him being in the military. So like I say, I don't think that will be a main issue. And even when this happened at the same time in the process that what was going on with Father Kapaun's cause, when everything kind of stopped first because of COVID, and then they asked us to start to have a different focus on Father Kapaun's life. So that's currently what we're doing, and our postulator over in Rome is doing, is kind of reworking the positio that we had presented to go and to support a new way that the dicasteries were looking at naming saints. And that was kind of a shift from proving that somebody led a life of heroic virtue and sanctity to a push to go to a newer way of showing sainthood or proving sainthood by showing that this person offered their life. That at some point in time they offered their life to God, and thus in offering their life to God, they lived the rest of their life as a saint. So that's kind of what we're doing with Father Kapaun's cause, is switching it to a focus on that, as opposed to that proof of his life of sanctity. And they said really nothing to us about Father Kapaun being in the military or anything like that. So I really don't think it's going to have an effect on Father Kapaun's cause.
Okay, thank you, Father. I have a question back here.
I was going to add to that too. I think part of the reasoning was because of the events in the war in Ukraine. So in a sense, it's a very temporal, specific time. But when Bishop Kemi was in Rome in April after the war had begun and spoke with the prefect, and he didn't, of the dicastery for saints, and he didn't have any issues. So, I mean, obviously there's no guarantees with any of it, but at the same time, I think, hopefully there's good reason to think that things can move forward. Yeah.
All right, I'm grateful to be here and thank you for the info that you've shared so far and being here. My question is, how is it possible to encounter Father Kapaun today and what he can say in our daily lives, especially in the face of war like Ukraine and all the other conflicts that are brewing around the world? If that,
I do think hopefully this afternoon session will have some good info on that too. But yeah, I mean, I think sometimes what I've seen, we like to say as part of Kapaun's men that he went foxhole to foxhole, and sometimes I've found that when times are the most trying is sometimes when he shows up, and so I think that there's a good. Just a good reminder, I mean, that he is with us and wants to bring that comfort, that peace that I kind of spoke of earlier. I think it's also a good reminder of how we ought to treat each other, and that something you've talked about before, even with COVID, is that like our lives still have meaning in some ways because we can give our lives to others and to serve other people that way. So I think his example is a good reminder of that for me. But I want to hear from you guys.
To kind of add on to what Scott was saying, all of the POWs that I talked to have said that they probably would not have made it out of the POW camp without the assistance of Father Kapaun. And they'll say the thing that he gave them more than anything else was that gift of hope, and knowing that things will get better, and knowing that the evils will not overcome the good. And I think that's what we have to go on from Father Kapaun also. I mean, this is a perfect age for us to kind of look at this. We can sit down and pick up a newspaper and it can be filled with bad stuff that is going on, but on every one of those things, we can still be a person of hope. And if we look at it and we look at it in terms of hope, Father Kapaun being that person of hope, or that giving that gift of hope, letting other people know that their lives had value, and it was in having that value or a valuable life that will give them that hope to continue to live.
Okay, question?
Could someone give us a brief synopsis of Father Kapaun's homecoming? What events happened for that to happen?
But like leading up to it, or like the events that we held here?
Yeah, like how, I know that there was a camp that, they brought the bones, but how did that
Sure.
happen? Who intervened with that?
Hey, Father, could you start with just when you got word that they had found his body, and then we kind of give a 30,000 view of everything else, because there's so much detail.
It was Ray Kapaun that called me up, David's brother, called me up and told me that they'd found Father Kapaun's remains. And I mean, I was there on the phone, and I mean, that was so far out of the picture for me. I mean, it didn't register. I thought, well, what is all this about? And then he said, well, they found his remains there in the punch bowl. And I mean, that's when it clicked, and it finally clicked as to what he was actually telling me. And I think probably one of the untold heroes of the finding of his remains is probably a man named Phil O'Brien, which I'm sure you know well also. Phil O'Brien worked for the Department of Defense, and basically one of his jobs was to try to identify everybody that died in prison camp number 5. And the first time that I met him, he said that he had the names of 1,400 men that died in prison camp number 5. And he said, I figure there's still about 200 out there that I haven't identified yet. And he said, I don't know that I will ever be able to identify him. And he's the first one that told me that there is a possibility of Father Kapaun's remains being in the Punch Bowl, the national cemetery there in Hawaii. And it was for him and his questioning whether or not Father Kapaun's remains were there, that I think ultimately led or got people going or kept people going in that search for his remains. From my understanding, the situation was after the Korean War was over. The North Koreans released the remains of a number of POWs, or people that had been killed. One of those was labeled as Father Kapaun. And they started to research and started to do looking to make sure that was him, when they found out that the person that had been identified or labeled as Father Kapaun was actually somebody that was much younger. It would have been somebody that would have been in their late teens or early 20s when Father Kapaun would have been 35 when he died. So they knew it wasn't Father Kapaun. They did other work and they were able to identify him. Well, then they had the remains of a number of others that they just buried as unknown soldiers because they were not able to identify them as that. And Father Kapaun wound up being one of those. And Phil O'Brien knew that this was a good chance that he was there. After the war, or it's probably been about 15 years ago, there was somebody that was identified as Sergeant Lusk that was buried in the Punch Bowl also as an unknown soldier. And we know that he was buried near where Father Kapaun had been buried. And his remains were identified. And Phil O'Brien believed that since he was buried near where Father Kapaun was, that surely they would have sent back the remains of Father Kapaun at that same time. So that also kind of renewed his thought that Father Kapaun was there in the Punch Bowl. So all of it kind of fell into place, and it was just a matter of time. And this is what Phil O'Brien said: it's just going to be a matter of time before they find his remains. And that's kind of what happened. So I don't know if you have more to add or...
Well, just add that the identifying remains that came back from Korea was particularly difficult because while the United States military is pretty careful about how we handle human remains, whether they're our own or from another country, the Chinese and North Koreans were far less thoughtful about that, and they would literally take bulldozers and shovel up tons of dirt and put them in a wooden box, and of course that process disrupts human remains, and you might get is a bone from a finger or something, because all those remains are going to get intermingled or damaged in the transfer. And so one reason it took decades is because we just did not have the DNA technology to identify remains from a single sample, but eventually we were able to develop that technology in the 90s, and even with it, it's still a painstakingly slow process, and it requires a matching DNA sample from a family member. And one of Phil's jobs when he was working for the Department of Defense was to travel the country and meet with the families of men reported as missing in action, and try to collect samples and other information to try to identify those remains in the Punch Bowl.
So one of the questions that I got a lot was, with the Trump administration bringing back the remains, this will happen long before that. So the prisoners were exchanged in 1953 for release. The remains were exchanged in 1954. And I think they spent a couple years trying to identify them, and there's 860 some that they couldn't ID, and they were taken and buried in Hawaii in 56, I think. So he had actually been there for a long time. Yeah.
If I could add one more thing about there's a lot that is said about the incorruptibles. I mean, those saints whose bodies are incorruptible, that are not corrupt after hundreds of years of them passing away. When I found out about Father Kapaun's remains coming back, and when I found out the extent of the remains that were there, I think that is probably, to me anyway, that is more telling than any saint that they may say is incorruptible. The fact that we have, what was it, 96% of his remains made it back home, I think is just astounding. Knowing full well what you're saying about how other countries did not care about the remains and how the remains were just all looped together. I mean, for the fact that we have his remains and we're missing a kneecap and the tips of some fingers and the tips of some toes, I think is unbelievable.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
So Bill mentioned how there were other leaders in the military who didn't quite fulfill what Father Kapaun was able to do in service to his fellow service members. And so I'm kind of wondering, and maybe this is kind of a question for the whole panel, like what really made him different in that? One of the things you also mentioned was his being reconciled to his death, which I thought was an interesting comment. So maybe it's related to that, or maybe there's more there to talk about.
So I'll talk briefly about what made him different from other military leaders, then I'll hand it off to my two partners up here. But one of the things that made Emil Kapaun different in the 8th Cavalry Regiment and among the POWs that he was initially captured with was his age. Emil Kapaun was a 34-year-old captain, and the average captain in the United States Army at that time was 25 or 26 years old. When I was a captain in the United States Army, I was 27 years old, 28 years old. And the enlisted men who made up the bulk of the prisoners with whom Kapaun was captured, most of them were in their teens, 18, 19, maybe 20 or 21 years old. But by comparison, Emil Kapaun was an old man. And yet he was also, for a guy in his mid-30s, vigorous. He was, I would say, what we would call country strong. He was a pretty hardy fellow. Furthermore, this was not his first war. He had already been to a war during World War II, and so he had more experience. He was more comfortable with the enlisted men that he was working with, and he had more credibility because of that. And so he had I think that gave him a better, more credible relationship with the enlisted men, and he had a better relationship with the officers because of that experience. He was not new. And so that experience proved vital. I think he knew how to influence men. He knew the power of leading by example. He knew which buttons to push to get men to do the right thing. He knew what to say. He knew how to act. I think he appreciated the importance of all those little things he did on a daily basis to establish and maintain his credibility among his fellow soldiers. So I think that's what made him different.
Scott or Father, you want to weigh in on that at all?
To kind of add on to that, when I talked about what the Congregation for Saints was asking for now is that a kind of a point in a person's life in which they lay down their life, give their life to God, and in doing so, giving their life to sainthood. It's interesting because Phil O'Brien is one person that kind of mentioned this to me also. He said that he believes on November 2nd, when Father Kapaun was captured, he made this decision. And that decision was that he knew that he wasn't going to make it out of there alive. So he was going to spend the rest of his life doing everything he could to help somebody else. And he said he thinks that is why he was able to be in the POW camp and to act without fear, to go against what their captors were telling him to do, but to act without fear and to go out and help other people, to go out and to help his fellow POWs. So he said that's what gave him the courage to do it, was this decision on that day to lay down his life for his fellow POWs. I kind of challenged Phil O'Brien and said, I agree completely with you saying that, but from looking at his life, I think there's other times in his life that you could say the same thing. And my thought was that he could say the same thing on that day that he was ordained, that he was laying down his life for those who he pastored. And so you couldn't really pinpoint one point that you could even go back even before that and say that he was laying down his life for his people in Pilsen and things like that. So I think that's what he did in the Army, was lay down his life. He was doing this without fear. He was doing it because he loved the enlisted men, and they knew that.
Scott, anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways he was accustomed to hardship and hard work because of his time growing up in Pilsen on the farm, and there's so much that shaped him there. But I do think, when he came to encounter our Lord more and really dedicated his life, there's a couple homilies where he talks about, one in particular, he talks about Jesus Christ, the Good Shepherd, and getting up early and defending the sheep and willing to give his life for the sheep. And I think that commitment, there's something that clicked at him. He was a very simple man, and he decided that this is true, the faith is true, and I'm going to follow it, and I'm going to imitate Christ. And he was able to live that out. And yeah.
Can I add one more thing, Mike? In a combat zone, these life and death issues and the concept of laying down one's life for others, it's not theoretical anymore. It's not a hypothetical. Men are dying, and you might die. And so that brings all of these ideas to a sudden clarity, and either you can live up to your self-image or you can't, and he did.
Yeah, I was in Korea when peace treaty was signed. They brought the prisoners back. I got to see them. They had bad shape. They put them in ambulance, they put them in ambulance, and with other, they put them in buses and took them out down to Busan.
Bill, you want to talk a little bit about your experience with exactly what he's asking about the prisoners that came home and were repatriated, and then those who weren't? Sure. The men who came home were the first thing they wanted to do was eat, and they fed them. They also deloused them, and they gave them clean uniforms. They gave them hot showers and razors so they could shave, and haircuts so they looked like soldiers again. But mainly what they wanted to do was eat. And they warned them. They warned them, don't eat too much. And they all ate too much, and they all got sick as dogs. But yeah, and then a lot of them were eventually flown to the port at Incheon, where MacArthur's troops had landed 3 years before, and went home on troop ships. And that was useful in some ways compared to Vietnam POWs who were flown home. The slow boat back from Korea gave these men a little time to decompress and adjust to the traumatic shift in their life circumstances. So that was in large part a good thing.
Can you tell about how Father Kapaun stood up to the captors and refused to be brainwashed, and how he would argue with the guys running the propaganda classes?
I'll be happy to. So on April 1st, about 7 weeks before his death, the Chinese, having replaced the North Koreans in running Camp 5, because even the Chinese were alarmed at how many prisoners had died in February and March under North Korean mismanagement of the camp. In late March, the Chinese replaced the North Koreans, reassumed control of the camp, And on April 1st, weather was getting warmer, they implemented a program to re-educate the American prisoners. And as I mentioned earlier, they'd had some success during the Chinese Civil War re-educating captured Chinese nationalists who really didn't have much choice in the matter. Either it was live out your life in a slave labor camp or convert to communism, so a lot of them converted. The Chinese wrongly assumed it would be a simple matter to persuade young American soldiers of the virtues of communism, and they were hopelessly wrong. But the initial efforts involved lectures from Chinese officers who spoke English about the virtues of communism and everything that was terrible about the West and capitalism. And Kapaun repeatedly stood up during those indoctrination sessions and politely but firmly contradicted the instructors, as they termed themselves. And that was one of several reasons that he essentially had a target on his back. The Chinese were already well aware of the influence he had over other prisoners. They had already identified him as a leader in the camp, and so weeks later, given the opportunity to send him to the death house where he would surely perish, they leapt at the opportunity to remove that thorn from their side. Let me talk briefly about brainwashing. Nobody was brainwashed. That was a myth. We were in the midst of McCarthyism back here in the States and deathly afraid that communist agents were undermining the moral and ethical values of our youth. And the fact that some prisoners in Korea misbehaved and collaborated with the enemy provided further proof, to include the fact that several prisoners refused repatriation when the shooting ended in 1953. 19 prisoners chose to stay in China rather than come back to the United States. Many of them had probably collaborated with the enemy in one form or the other. Why did prisoners collaborate? In some cases, they did so to save their lives. In some cases, they did so because they broke under torture. And as Senator McCain famously said, everybody breaks under torture. And in general, I agree with him in general, almost everybody does break under torture. And the military understands that, I think, for the most part. But the Chinese failed at achieving widespread conversion among the soldiers to communism, even though as a step in that direction, they eventually realized that the officers and the non-commissioned officers were exerting a positive influence on the junior enlisted soldiers, so they segregated them, they segregated the officers, they segregated the non-commissioned officers, they also segregated the Hispanic soldiers, they segregated the African American soldiers, and it was very clearly an effort to divide and conquer. And it still failed because 18 and 19-year-old American prisoners don't want to talk about Hegelian dialectics or Marxist-Leninist theory all day. They want to talk about cars and women and food. And the Chinese would leave the American prisoners in small discussion groups and give them a list of topics to discuss for the day, and they would appoint the smallest, weakest junior member of the group to be in charge and direct that person to take notes and write up a summary of the important topics they had discussed that day. And so towards the end of every daily session, in some groups there was a group effort to come up with a fictional account of the important topics they had discussed. But most groups spent the day talking about whatever they wanted to talk about, or they'd sleep, and with one guy as the lookout in case the Chinese came back to check on him. And that was how the indoctrination effort went for the next several months. It was a cockeyed idea by the Chinese that failed miserably. What they did not fail to do, though, and achieve quite a bit of alarming success in sowing dissent among prisoners and turning them against each other. And some of this manifested itself after the war when prisoners accused each other of collaboration, in some cases legitimately, and in many cases simply because I didn't like that guy. Unfortunately, that all of those accusations fed this myth that there was a massive collapse of our values among prisoners in captivity. Later studies showed that while there was collaboration and misconduct among prisoners in Korea, it was no more or less than similar bad behavior among prisoners in World War II, or the Civil War, or the First World War, or in Vietnam. People are human. Humans make mistakes and sometimes behave badly. So
we are, I smell lunch. But I'd like to just close with, I'm going to put somebody on the spot. Not a panelist, you can take a rest for a minute. I'd like to ask Rob Knapp. Rob is the president of Cape and Mount Carmel Catholic High School. If you can just share briefly how the influence of Father Kapaun is lived out at the school on a daily basis through retreats or whatever the case might be. I think it kind of gets to the point that somebody asked about earlier about how do we continue to see the life of Father Kapaun impact us.
Well, thank you, Mike, and this is literally on the spot. Kids don't remember facts and figures and dates with any real regularity, and if they do, it's really not useful to them. What they remember for a long, long period of time is a relationship that they have with someone to whom they look up, and an example of virtuous life that they have, that they see by someone to whom they look to. And with Father Kapaun at our school, and I know other Catholic schools in the diocese, what we focus on is not the facts and the figures and the dates and everything that Bill has enlightened me on over the years and us today, but more on what Father talked about, and that is the hope that Father Kapaun gave to the men in Camp 5, which had a greater survival rate than other camps like it during the Korean War. And we can attribute that to many things. I like to attribute that to Father Kapaun and the hope that he instilled in those men every single day. And it wasn't anything superhuman. It's something that we can all do at any given time. And our students can recognize that, and they can mimic that in their own lives, because in their own special way, not to minimize anything that Father Kapaun and the POWs and our veterans have gone through, but in their own special way, our kids live through POW camps every day. Right? Our society is not geared towards them to have hope. Our society is geared towards them to have fear and trepidation over what's going to come. And that's what they feed on every time they open up their social media accounts. And so to have somebody that can instill hope in them and give them an example of how simple acts of courage, of love, and of charity can bring hope to a society through Father Kapaun, that's what we hope to instill in our kids. And if we can give them the hope that they can then go spread when they get to college and beyond, then we think we can transform society. And so Father Kapaun's example to us is a little bit less about history and more about the hope of what is to come for all of us.
Just think if I would have given him 5 minutes to prepare what he would have said. That's great, Rob. Thank you. Okay, let's thank our panelists, please.